Thank you, Simon, and I wanted to say that it's a wonderful pleasure for me to be here with you also. What I'm going to try to do in this talk is to give a very broad brush view of sustainability from many points of view, to talk about some of the questions that we have, talk about some of the ingredients in it, what some of us and our institutions might do about it, and I'll try to keep it open and filled with questions, and then I'll look forward to some good discussion at the end. The key to finding sustainability for the future may actually have been indicated by the at least incipient and we hope continuing cooperation in the economic sphere right now at the present time, because I think many people who might have been skeptical about it are now finding it impossible to avoid the conclusion that solutions will not be found to the world economic dilemma unless the nations of the world get together. And so what I hope in a very sort of a Pollyanna way is that perhaps the inspiration that led to the formation of the United Nations in 1944, and if you want to cry, just go and look at the pictures of the delegates getting together that are in Muir Woods at California, San Francisco at the present time. Perhaps some of the feeling then that the nations of the world needed to take concerted actions will resurface using perhaps the financial crisis as a model, and will allow us to begin to address some of the components of sustainability in ways that we couldn't have imagined doing before. At any rate, that's a hope. Certainly there are no problems in the world that can be solved individually, and lots of the problems that are current in the world are really coming to roost at the present time. In summer of 2007, my wife Pat and I went with a group of evangelical Christians and scientists up to Alaska to look at the effects of global warming. After we've had a couple of preliminary meetings with them and realized that we were all equally interested in protecting the Earth and what the Earth has to offer, we took this trip to Alaska, and here we are at Shishmaref, which is an island in the Arctic Ocean, and which is inhabited by about 700 Inuit people who've been there for about 3,000 years. And here's what the end street on Shishmaref looks like at the present time. That house had just fallen off before, 3 days before we got there and the picture was taken. But basically, as the permafrost that holds the island together, this island that's been inhabited for 3,000 years, melts, the people who live there are increasingly subjected to scenes like this. When I showed this picture to Simon and my mutual very good friend, Paul Ehrlich, he said, well, gosh, when I landed in Shishmaref in 1955, which is true, there was 1,000 feet of beach going out beyond that point, and we just landed on the beach. Everything's gradually eroding down into it. The elders of the village have already voted to leave, but there are only 700 of them, and it would take approximately $170 million for them to relocate on the mainland in a comparable kind of situation. The pack ice doesn't come up around the island anymore, and so when they try to go out over the ice to hunt in winter, people are being killed and accidents are happening, and their whole way of life is simply not being possible anymore. This is a picture in southern Alaska on the Kenai Peninsula. There are millions and millions of spruce trees being killed there. And of course, there are epidemics like that in large, monotonously uniform conifer forests all over the world. But what's happening here is that the season is so elongated that the bark beetles can go through 3 broods in the season, and thus they're really killing the trees, whereas at 2 there was kind of a natural control on it. This summer was the first summer that sweet corn has been grown successfully in Alaska in enough quantities to sell, and that's a sign of the times also. Another unifying factor, or potentially unifying factor, that we see in the world right now is the very rapidly increasing cost for food, which has to do with a lot of individual factors, some of which are enumerated on this slide. There are simply more and more people demanding more and more food, and the drought in Australia, which is almost certainly associated with global warming, is one indication of the kinds of changes that are happening and the difficulties that people will have adapting to them. As a result of this, there have been violent protests over food in about 30 countries this year. Major exporters of rice, Thailand and Vietnam, have had to cut way back. China has had to secure its rice supplies, and global grain reserves are at an all-time low. And people, of whom there are many miserable ones all over the world already, are seeing their lives turn even worse with the scarcity of food that's going on at the present time. And as I say, it's driven by many factors, not any single one. The human population really began to rise with the development of domestic crops and domestic animals in the eastern Mediterranean and the Fertile Crescent, which winds around from what's now Israel, from the first places that are rain-fed over through Syria into Iraq. And that's where that's where crop domestication, as far as we knew, took place first. And then, of course, it took place independently many other places in the world. There were some small villages at the time that people first learned to do these tricks, but they were very small, and they existed only in places where, for one reason or another, there was a superabundance of grain or seafood or something like that that let a group of people stay in one place. It's very difficult to estimate, but the whole population of the entire world 10,500 years ago, after 2 million years of human presence on the earth, was probably approximately 3 to 4 million people. In other words, a small fraction of the size of one of the large cities in the world at the present time. Although hunter-gatherers had certainly learned how to stab a number of large land vertebrates to death and drive some of them to extinction in their search for food, and to burn to improve pastures, for example. People had had fire for a long time by that point. People had invented painting in caves before that point. In general, the impact of human beings on the rest of the earth was very slight compared to anything that it's ever been since. With the development of crops and domestic animals, then of course the small villages began to grow into towns and cities, and not only did the human population begin to move up with increasing rapidity, but also people began to be able to specialize in their professions within those villages, towns, and cities, so that some could be religious leaders, some could be political leaders, some could be musicians, some could be weapons makers, and so forth, and some could be agriculturists, pastoralists. And in those growing villages, towns, and cities grew the roots of what we consider civilization at the present day, as people were more and more specialized, bartered things with one another. At the same time, of course, those carried the seeds of struggles and battles between one group of people and another, both over the food that they stored to pass over unfavorable seasons, but also for the land on which they could grow, on which they could graze domestic animals or grow crops. And the movement of the Israelites into the first place on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean where there was enough rainfall to grow crops without irrigation away from the dry edges of the Nile, and then displacing and killing off the people who were there to get their land, is a very good example of this. Written languages came in about 5,000 years ago, about halfway from the first crops to now. And it's not surprising that in the written traditions that we have, the age of the world goes back about that distance, about 5,000 years, because that's sort of the jumping off point, the point at which people looking back could tell their myths and think of their creation stories, but be able to do it in a way that would be viable generation after generation. World population development, of course, has grown unusually rapidly in recent years. There seem to have been several million people, something like the population of Europe or the United States at the time of Christ. And one interesting thing about this is, notice that when the Reverend Thomas Malthus was making his predictions about population growth being so fast that it would outstrip food production, that the whole population of the world was about 850 million people, considerably smaller than the population of India or China at the present time. What the Reverend Malthus didn't count on was that the Industrial Revolution, by allowing the development of plows that could add a lot of land to agriculture and also processes by which various fertilizing elements could be manufactured, enabled the agricultural sphere to be broadened and enabled more food to be produced. So although certainly many hundreds of millions of people have starved to death between the 1790s and now, it's not quite on the scale that he imagined. The global population hit 1 billion people for the first time in Napoleonic times, 2 billion people in about 1930, 2.5 billion people in 1950, and now it's about 6.7 billion people, which most people think will not stabilize for another perhaps going on 2 billion more people than we have now. Even though the high points for population growth in percentages was in 1971, and the high point for population growth in numbers was in the early 1990s. And so you're beginning to see the start of a sigmoid curve there. But it depends very much on the attention we pay to the world population situation, whether it ever stabilizes at all. It seems obvious to many of us that the policy of the United States to basically deny family planning assistance to other countries around the world, given the fact that we have 4.5% of the world's population using 25% of the world's productivity and economy to support our standard of living, is one of the most incredibly stupid things that we could possibly do. And it's unfortunate that what's perfectly legal inside the United States is offered as a sop, apparently, to our very conservative elements in the United States, and then not offered to other people for whom these methods are as legal as they are here, because of some misplaced idea that somehow morality might be served in that way. We depend, the 4.5%, 25% ratio shows very clearly how we depend on the sustainability of everyone in the entire world for our continued existence and for any kind of an elevated standard of living like the one we enjoy. I'll get on with whether we can continue to enjoy that or not. But the situation is very difficult. A lot of people, particularly in the United States, tend to say that population is really the only problem, which kind of implies that if only the dumb people in Brazil and Indonesia would stop having babies, that we could just waltz away into an aura of permanent happiness here in the United States. That is a gross oversimplification. Our friends Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren and others began to show, even in the early 80s or even before that, that in fact, which now seems very obvious, impact on the earth is a product of population consumption, which I think this slide demonstrates very clearly. Every house there with several acres, every house with a swimming pool, every house difficult to heat and cool, but being heated and cooled to the max. No sidewalks. Everybody drives probably 10 miles to the nearest Walmart or whatever stores they go to. And in every way, a development like that is a device for wasting energy and wasting virtually everything else that we use. It is notable that in the United States we use about twice as much energy per capita as the members of any other nation on earth, so including Britain, Germany, Switzerland, Sweden and all. It's very difficult to demonstrate that they're suffering badly as a result of only getting half as much energy as we do. And so the next time you hear drill, baby, drill, which is a nice, if perverted, takeoff on the 60s, remember that the best thing we could do to save energy here is to do, for example, what's indicated in legislation pending in California now, to think about the scope and size and form of our cities and the ways in which we work together to conserve energy, and very much is to be gained by conservation. In fact, at a first approximation, we're wasting about half the energy that we use. So let's ask ourselves, do we really want to burn all the petroleum we can get our hands on, considering the unmanageable changes that that would make in average global temperatures and all the associated things that go along with them? Or if we couldn't somehow trouble ourselves to live a little more conservatively, use a little less, not consume as much. And then, of course, there's technology. The Olympics recently completed brought to mind the fact that 96 of the 100 largest cities in China are among the most polluted in the world. David Letterman, on the other hand, had a good line. He said, "Autumn is my favorite season of the year in Los Angeles. It's when the birds change color and fall out of the trees." Before that, Jack Benny used to say, in Los Angeles, where you wake up to the coughing of the birds. Although the form of the air pollution differs widely in various places, and in China, the major source of pollution is burning soft coal, the same as the major source of pollution in cities of the central and eastern United States in the 20s and 30s. And that, of course, is very, very bad human health problem, since any particle smaller than about 250 microns can go in your lungs and get directly involved with cancer. The Chinese think that about 700,000, or about a third of the cancer deaths per year, result from inhaling those particles. Whereas as economies mature beyond that point, then you get into transportation as the major problem. You have the kind of problem that our friend Mario Molina addresses in Mexico City, for example, about modernizing the transportation, trying to cut down on air pollution that way. Automobiles in China, by the way, are 50% more efficient on the whole in fuel and other ways than automobiles in the United States, which is some kind of a black mark on us. I wonder why that happened. Now, people are using, I strongly suggest, if you haven't done so, you look at the website globalfootprint.org, which is a think tank in Oakland, California. And human beings are presently using, diverting, or wasting an estimated 50% of the total net photosynthetic productivity on land. Either we're using it, feeding it to animals, burning it down, making it into golf courses, or doing something with it. At the same time, this is a picture of the Jordan River, which on the one hand might make you wonder why it was such a big deal for Moses to try to get across, but anyway, it was. We have to accept that on faith, so to speak. This is the Jordan River, which is there simply to remind us that we're also using about 55% of the sustainable supplies of fresh water in the world. And when you're mining artesian water, you're of course into a one-time use of water. And when you're mining it, as is customary in India, for example, where pumps to pump up artesian water are highly subsidized by the government, then you tend just to pump it up, use it, and forget about it, so all the surface water rapidly becomes polluted and you're really stuck. In Israel, all the water is used about 3.5 to 4 times before it reaches the ocean, and that's the kind of thing we need also to get into, and people are beginning to investigate more and more. But when we can say we're using nearly half of the photosynthetic productivity on land and over half of the sustainable supplies of fresh water, then we really ought to be saying, but we're one of 12 million or more species of eukaryotic organisms, and that's an awful big share. In fact, people worry about extinction, and what you could say about extinction is we worry about species disappearing, but there's certainly one species which, if it would disappear, would leave the other 11,999,000 cheering wildly, and that would be us. Now, since 1950, we've lost about 15% of the topsoil worldwide. And topsoil, which in Iowa in 1840 was this thick, is now this thick. And of course, it doesn't get replenished at anything like that rate. And although people, especially in more developed places like the United States, are applying no-till agriculture and various strategies to save the soil better than has been customary, we clearly have a commodity there that's running out fast. We have 20% less agricultural land than we did in 1950, which is rather amazing because it shows that we're growing food for 6.7 billion people on 80% of the land that we were growing food for 2.5 billion people in 1950. I had a shock recently when I realized that the world population has tripled during my lifetime. I mean, small wonder that we're worrying about all these things. It's getting harder and harder. Between 1945 and 1973, in the United States, as people were fleeing to the suburbs and building interstate highways, we paved over an area of the United States the size of the state of Ohio, just between 1945 and 1973. And if you've been in the Central Valley of California, my home state, recently, you could see that the whole area from north, from Red Bluff and Redding to Bakersfield, is slowly being converted into a sprawling megalopolis in one of the most important pieces of agricultural land in the U.S. A third of the forests have been cut down. Carbon dioxide, one of the roughly 16 major greenhouse gases, the major one that human beings are churning out, has been increased about a sixth. Half of all the increase that we're going to talk about later has happened since 1970. And ozone in the stratosphere, of course, ozone at ground level is a serious pollutant, but ozone in the stratosphere has gone down to the point where the incidence of malignant skin cancer has risen about 20 to 25% in latitudes like the United States. Now consider what aspirations we have as human beings. If you read the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, you would assume that everyone can achieve the levels of consumption of living of the industrialized countries just by being smarter, better, more facile, putting fertilizer on their soil or something. But is that really the case? If our populations and expectations continue to grow and we continue to use the same technologies, there's no way that that's the case. Globalfootprint.org calculates that we're now using about 125% of everything the world produces on an ongoing basis. In 1970, they estimated that we were using about 70%. In other words, our combination of consumption, numbers of people, very unevenly distributed numbers of people, and the kinds of technologies that we're seem to be hopelessly hooked on, that combination doesn't have any give in the system at all. There's no way that various countries can push to the top, and there's no way in the world, regardless of how much advertisers might like it, that people could live at the standard that we do in the United States throughout the rest of the world, consuming what we do and using the same technologies. Only leveling the worldwide population, Joel Cohen has pointed out very elegantly in his book that it's not a matter of how many people can the world support, it's really a matter of what kind of a world do you want to have, and then that will determine the number of people that the world can support. A very serious question. We need social justice, We need people not only to think about the poor and disadvantaged people around them who have no access to health care or anything else, but we need people to think about other people over the whole world who lack that access too. Those will be necessary ingredients, as will greatly improved technologies, if we really want to achieve a sustainable world. Many of the new technologies that I've just mentioned will be based on biodiversity, biological diversity. So to review some of the facts, with a world with 6.7 billion people growing rapidly, still growing rapidly numerically, if not in percentage, 50% of the world's population lives on under $2 a day, and a quarter of us live on less than $1 a day. 1 in 8 people, over a billion people, are starving in the sense that they don't get enough food as children for their brains to develop properly, and they don't get enough food as adults to maintain their bodies. And 100 million people in the world right now are on the brink of starvation. If you put that together with the kind of ratio that I talked about between what the United States uses and how many people we have, and how much of the world's sustainable productivity we're using, it's not, and how much we really care about all these other people, we're really not likely to get anywhere very fast. Now some words about biological diversity. Biological diversity is essential for our lives, and we hope to use a lot of the attributes of biological diversity on the basis of the properties of living organisms, and yet we're driving them to extinction, just getting rid of them, offing them at an unprecedented rate. So I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about why should we try and how can the process be reversed. Well, in the first place, we get all of our food, for all practical purposes, directly or indirectly from plants. We get over 90% of it from about 100 kinds of plants, and yet there are thousands that have been cultivated somewhere in the world in the past and might be useful in a world where the basic conditions of agriculture are changing as rapidly as we do now. We also need the diversity of our major crops in order to be able to fend off diseases. And you know, I often give the illustration, if Asian flu came in a corner of this room, it would not by any means affect everybody in this room. It might get a lot of people, but not everybody. If you look around you, you can easily see why. But if the diversity that's present in the room, which is something like the diversity in that corn ears in that corn crib in Puebla in central Mexico, but if you thought of yourself as a corn plant in one of the fields in Iowa, and then you thought of yourself as looking around, every single plant you saw would not only look identical, it would be close enough to genetically identical, which means a very soft target. In addition, about 2/3 of the people in the world use plants directly as their medicines, and even for those of us who buy their medicines in the drugstore, about 1/4 of the ones we buy are taken from a plant originally, and about another 1/4 from some other kind of organism. And there are undoubtedly many more drugs and useful products that we haven't even begun to explore yet, exploration having moved heavily into marine animals and fungi and so forth. About 5,000 kinds of antibiotics from bacteria and fungi have been patented since the end of World War II. So there are great frontiers there and great things we could do with them, but driving them to extinction is not a very good way to do it. Then we've had about 40 years of molecular revolution in the world, 50 years since Watson and Crick, but about 40 years since people actually began to figure out what DNA sequences were, how they coded for proteins, and how they might be manipulated. This leads to extraordinary advances about basic biology in terms of knowing how genes function. And more people who work at the molecular and cellular levels of biology are interesting themselves in the variability of gene systems from one kind of organism to another as a way of calibrating or understanding the operation of those systems at once. I mean, when I was teaching in general biology at Stanford in the mid-60s, we were teaching that all genetics, eukaryotic and prokaryotic, was identical. That's far from the truth, and there's still extraordinary finds being made all the time 40 years later. And of course, one of the many different kinds of things we can do is to produce transgenic plants or transgenic animals that receive characteristics from other organisms which may or may not be related. You can see here field trials of papaya ring spot in Hawaii. All of the papayas in Hawaii and all the papayas that are grown basically in the Pacific area are now genetically modified as a result. And as people work more and more with drought resistance, salt tolerance, and other kinds of things in trying to take advantage of as much agricultural land as possible, these techniques will prove to be more and more important. Ecosystem services, it's obvious, and there's been a great lot of talk about this recently, that natural ecosystems protect topsoils, protect runoff of water, determine local climates, like these mangroves in northeastern Australia, provide breeding sites, provide sites for pollinating insects and for birds and other insects that would come out and catch ones that were trying to eat your crops, and generally keep the world in balance. Bob Costanza, an environmental economist, has calculated that environmental services are worth about $37 trillion a year, about equal to the world's entire gross economic output. But of course, that's absurd, because if we didn't have them, we'd all be dead, and the only people who could measure them would be newly arrived green men from Mars, presumably. They're absolutely essential. There are 1.7 million named species of eukaryotes, non-bacteria, non-viruses, for which we have no way of estimating numbers at all. A project of which the Missouri Botanical Garden is a member, the Encyclopedia of Life, is intending to try to put up a web page on every one of those species. It's a lot easier than you might think to try to do that, because of the third bullet above. There are a relatively small number of species about which more than a very minimal amount is known. Most species are very poorly known. You can lay it all out very simply and very easily. But this project, which is supposed to be completed in 8 more years, will have produced by that time web pages for the 1.7 million species, or however many more may be ordered to that, and that will be convenient. Now, my estimate for the minimum number of species of eukaryotes in the world would be about 12 million. So as you can see, there's a great majority of species aren't even named, so you can't retrieve any information about them. And I've often pointed out that if you burn tropical forest, about 19 out of 20 of the kinds of organisms that you're burning will not be registered or named. Most of them will be, of course, less than 2 millimeters long, insects, mites, nematodes, and so forth. But each one, with eukaryotic cells and all, is a complex product of 3.5 billion years of evolution, at least, unique in its own right and contributing to the understanding of life on Earth. In other words, we know very little about the organisms on Earth, even though we're driving them to extinction very rapidly. How rapidly? Well, if since the end of the Cretaceous period, 65, 66 million years ago, you look at fossils of organisms like vertebrates that leave hard body parts, or mollusks of certain kinds where you can trace them, you get the extinction of about 1 million species per year. 1 per million per year, not 1 million per year, 1 per million per year. So in the order of a dozen, or a small number like that, over most of the past 65 million years. An extinction at that level is easily replaced by evolutionary processes that are going on at the same time. Now, for the last 500 years, since the invention of movable type, we've had books describing organisms in various parts of the world, And if we look at butterflies, vertebrates, plants, other kinds of organisms where we can trace actual rates of extinction during that period, we can see that the rate has gone up to about 100 per million per year, and it's probably reaching 1,000 per million per year. And this is always extrapolating from well-known groups to poorly known groups. Thousands of species are being lost per year now, irretrievably lost. And again, the number is going up very rapidly for reasons that I'm about to outline, so that half or more of all species may easily be lost by the end of the century that we've just entered, which would mean that this century will be an extinction event like that at the end of the Cretaceous period 65 million years ago, when the whole character of life on Earth shifted and took about up to 10 million years to recover. The major forces in species extinction are habitat destruction, usually driven by commercial gain, like putting in cattle pastures, getting timber, one thing or another like that, occasionally affected by people's overuse of natural habitats. Invasive alien species like the purple loosestrife or like the Phragmites, the reed that fills all the rushes around here, which represents an introduced aggressive weedy strain of a native species that used to be much more restricted in range before the one that you now see filling the marshes came in from Europe. Or the mosquitoes that killed off all the birds below a certain level on Hawaii, all the native birds, when they were introduced there and began to spread avian malaria from one to the other. Certain kinds of plants and animals, and you've all heard of bushmeat hunting, which is very popular in Africa and other places, and which provides illegal supplies of unusual animals on the back streets of London in very large numbers. Or ginseng's a familiar one. When you look at one of these shelves in a supermarket or a grocery store that has all these nutritional supplements on them, many of them are from China or India, and only about 12% of all of them in those places are actually cultivated. All the rest are gathered in nature, and of course with an increasing worldwide drive to get them, you find them disappearing. And then of course, very well known here, global warming. This slide shows the rise from pre-industrial levels, in other words, from the late 1700s, shows a number of scenarios. The world climate, the average global climate is already up about 0.9 degrees Celsius. It will go up about another 0.5 degrees Celsius as the temperature equilibrates with the greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere. And this median range during the course of the century of all of these scenarios is about at the level that people are saying is the highest we can sustain. In other words, between 350 and 450 parts per million will cause that kind of a shift in temperature, and anything above 3 degrees rise Celsius in temperature will entrain a lot of very unfavorable things: more violent storms, more rapidly rising sea level, shifted patterns of precipitation that are threatening the world food supply, and so forth. So there's a general consensus, which people have not signed up to, that we have to try to reduce the temperature. One thing that all those models have in common is that all of the area in the lower 48 states above timberline will be gone by the end of this century. In other words, no alpine slopes, no tundra in Colorado. That is clearly all on the way out. And of course, as it's on the way out, the habitats for the plants and animals, fungi, microorganisms that are confined to higher elevations simply disappear. They can't go up in the air. They might in some cases, they will in some cases, come down on rocky slopes or something below the new timberline, but that will presumably be a limited number. The International Panel on Climate Change estimated anywhere between 20 and 40% extinction of all species in the world based on climate change alone during the course of this century. And even if that's a bit high, which it could be, it's pretty shocking. As a really vivid example of what's happening in the world, look at the USDA horticultural guidelines. There are 9 hardiness zones that the USDA recognized in the United States in 1990, ranging from very tropical, subtropical, and so forth, all the way up to zone 9, which is sort of very cold, subarctic. Well, look at it in 1990, and then look what the National Arbor Day Foundation found using the same parameters 16 years later. For example, look at the state of Missouri, which is where I live. The whole thing's gone from zone 6 to zone 5 over the course of that 16 years. And if you can see it, the same thing has really happened in New Jersey. New Jersey has shifted one whole climate zone. We were able to grow camellias out of doors in St. Louis for the first time this winter without covering them, and they flowered beautifully this spring. 10 years ago, people would have thought that was ridiculous. Armadillos have arrived in St. Louis from southwestern Missouri. Birds like scissor-tailed flycatchers and white-winged doves, which we'd never see that far north, are now showing up with some regularity. So you're looking at about 10 miles northward creep of the climate zone per year over that period, if you measure it by minimum temperatures experienced regularly during the winter, which is really quite astonishing and a quite graphic demonstration of what's going on. Now, if we want to preserve biological diversity, there are various things we can do. We can protect natural areas, but elevation in natural areas becomes much more important than it was before. Corridors become much more important. We can bring especially endangered species of organisms into captivity or cultivation, now probably with the hope of putting them out again somewhere else than where they were native. A recent analysis of the roughly 2,400 endemic plants of California shows that half of them are at danger of becoming extinct as a result of climate change during the first half of this century. They're very local, and their habitats just don't exist in the future. We need to combat alien invasive species, which will be spreading in unpredictable patterns as the climate shifts. And we have to, on the matter of gathering species in nature, provide alternatives that will produce drugs as good as those that we could gather in nature, but grown in cultivation. So these are some of the kinds of parks and reserves that you might imagine, but there are real limits to it. As the temperatures get warmer and warmer, particularly on the ends of lands in the southern hemisphere, the opportunity for persistence of those organisms that occur at higher elevations goes down and down. Now, Mike Rosenzweig of the University of Arizona has pointed out very beautifully in some of his books with the concept of win-win ecology or reconciliation ecology, that biodiversity can't really be preserved in parks alone, that we need to preserve it in urban areas, in tree lots, in grasslands, in backyards, in front yards, and all the rest. And of course, in that sense, the 2 million acres rapidly growing that are taken out of conservation reserve in the United States are a real tragedy. I've had the opportunity in the last couple of months to crisscross central and northern Illinois in several different directions. And when you go there, you really think you're seeing the future, because all the biodiversity that exists is along roadsides and in little uncultivated areas between the fields, and really needs special protection and encouragement if people's lives are going to continue to be interesting, diverse, and worthwhile. Botanical gardens, which already have about 100,000 of the roughly 300,000 kinds of plants in the world in cultivation, are more and more going to probably be seen as bridges between one kind of habitat and another kind of habitat, and that role is going to get more and more critical. Accumulating and disseminating knowledge in various ways, and now notably over the web, are going to be very important so that we can know, what we have established, and then get, by that familiarity with organisms, deal with them effectively. This is a Missouri Botanical Garden office in Peru, which is manned by about 25 Peruvians, instructing park guards in how to inventory and take care of the plants in their in their parks so that they can deal with changes there and safeguard the biodiversity better. These are a couple of Malagasy members of our team in Madagascar, where we have about 60 staff members, all but one Malagasy, who are out gathering plants for looking at their medicinal properties along with the Ministry of Health in Madagascar and the National Cancer Institute in the United States. It's become almost a truism these days, but it can't be said too often, that exposing young children, especially 4 to 10 years old, to nature when they have a chance to do it is one of the most worthwhile and important things that we could possibly do to safeguard the world of the future. And even beyond biological diversity or a healthy curiosity and familiarity with nature, to produce caring and adults who really give a darn about what they see and try to get to the root of things rather than, well, I won't name any names right now. The incorporation of education about sustainability and the environment into the curriculum throughout is very important. Informal opportunities are exceedingly important, and if you have any influence on your own children or grandchildren or schools or any other body that can do the job, museums, make sure they do it. I often think about the responsibilities of a modern university. Ponder the fact that the students who are graduating now will see a world that has a third more people than it does now. It'll be massively polluted. There'll be a massive loss of biodiversity going on. Global warming will have gone on to the point where the unmanageable events that are taking place now are going to be truly remarkable. There are going to be worldwide water shortages and persistent worldwide food shortages. And what I would ask us all to consider is whether any university graduate can be considered to be properly educated if they don't know the basic principles of environmental science. They're not going to learn it while reading in the Wall Street Journal who just yelled at whom about some kind of a misapprehension of the truth. And we need people who can function as intelligent citizens. And of course, a great university like Princeton, where so many of the graduates assume very important positions later in life, I think has a special responsibility to give them the tools for dealing with this matter. In the bigger picture, the preservation of biological diversity will take place only to the extent that we achieve a sustainable world by limiting and then reversing global warming, developing alternative energy sources, social justice, caring first of all about the poor people, the people who lack health insurance in your own community, but then extending that love all over the entire world, because there's no way that you're going to deal effectively with Somalia or Rwanda or Burkina Faso or any of the other places in the world if you don't care about it at all. Empowering people everywhere, particularly women and children who are so readily excluded from the whole equation, achieving population stability, and bringing many new technologies online are all going to be important if we want to have a sustainable world. And for countries like the United States to not care about it is going to be increasingly costly to us and to everybody else. These women in the Western Ghats in India are learning how to extract from amla, which is a very important medicinal herb grown there, so that more of the value of what they're getting can be kept in the village than just simply traded off for peanuts to middlemen and then brought to New Delhi, where it can be purified and where the profit can be concentrated. These school kids in Peru are being helped by some of our people to grow tomatoes and do other things to improve their nutrition. Basically, sustainability begins with each and every one of us. In the United States, where, as I already pointed out, we waste half of our energy, we have a special responsibility to get on with it. It's perfectly obvious that the United States is no longer going to be able to go to the head of the line, if ever was, and say, everybody follow us. But it's equally obvious that we and China and the other truly powerful countries of the world that have a major impact are going to have to be among the leaders, or we're simply not going to get through to better solutions. We've got to get over preserving carefully every iota of all the existing industries and begin to adopt new technologies and new ways of looking at things. Amory Lovins of the Rocky Mountain Institute pointed out long ago that we would undoubtedly make money as a nation if we could get into alternative energy and get away from the traditional forms of energy, quite apart from the fact that we can't afford to burn all the fossil fuel that we have, or even much more of it, without causing irreversible changes. Stefan Schmidheiny, a Swiss industrialist who founded the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in 1991, in the build-up to the World Environmental Summit in Rio, said in an op-ed piece in the New York Times in 1991, did I say 81? In 1991, there's no greater gift that American industry can give to European and Japanese industry than to go on pretending that global warming does not exist. Because while you're doing it, we'll be developing all the technology that we'll be selling back to you later. And basically, you're putting yourself into the same position that you were in the early 70s when you said small, efficient Japanese cars clearly had no market in the United States. Well, duh, about 16 years later, we're kind of coming to the party. Denmark, faced with the same challenges that we were in 1971, became entirely energy self-sufficient and has a huge industry in alternative energy technology, which it's selling all over the world. The relevant minister in Denmark just remarked that 13 new companies were started doing alternative energy technology in China last year, 0 in the United States. So China's a real competitor, but we're just sitting there getting ready to import more and drill baby drilling around the shore. There's lots that we can do. There's lots that we can do individually. There's lots that we can do that can make the world more sustainable. And since each one of us in the United States is such a high consumer, if you consider, for example, the 165 million people here added since the end of World War II are living at 30 or 40 times the level of consumption of poor people in Brazil or Indonesia, then you can get an idea of what our relative impact is really on the world individually, and hopefully can be inspired into doing better. I think there are 4 very important things we can do, and I put them in some kind of order. We've got to promote international understanding in the United States. All countries are more or less isolationist, but if we have no image of the whole world, it's unlikely that we're going to act on it. We've got to learn, and that's why I stress the importance of education in this area, because we need information before we start yelling at one another. Nowadays, it seems fair game just to issue a whole series of laws and then have people sort of believe them. A lot of people believe them, it's sort of okay. But anyone who deals with the environmental situation on any side before they decide what that side is and before they decide to act had better learn and keep themselves current. And I hope that Princeton and other universities will work harder and harder to give them the opportunity to have a basis for learning and then acting and then voting, which is such an important privilege in the United States. In conclusion, then, should we be optimists or pessimists? Well, if you're an optimist because you think that science and technology are going to save us, you're nuts. The Wall Street Journal believes that. The Wall Street Journal really believes that, but scientists and engineers don't believe that. Obviously, scientists and engineers can make a huge contribution, but they can't save us. The only thing that can save us is a combination of sensible population policies, consumption levels, and the introduction of new technologies, all being important. If you think people are going to come from Mars and save us, well, then you're probably acting rationally. But where and when are they coming? It finally all depends on each and every one of us and what we do, and I think Gandhi put it very well when he said this: the world provides enough to satisfy every man's need, but not every man's greed. If you're sliding into a midlife crisis and we're about to go out and buy a Hummer to mitigate it, think of something, think again, think more carefully, or as Peter Pan said to Michael, think lovelier thoughts, Michael. The world needs us all to cooperate. It needs our institutions to cooperate. It needs our nation to cooperate. And we've got to get on with this, because just as in the current financial crisis, there is absolutely no hope of achieving a peaceful, sustainable, healthy world until we're individually devoted to it. You can go around whining and complaining forever about why governments and corporations don't get engaged, but then ask yourself, what reason have they really got to get engaged if individual citizens don't ask them to get engaged? When 20 million people, 1/10 of the population of the United States, came out for the first Earth Day, that was enough to get everyone's attention and enough to get Richard Nixon, who was, despite his very bizarre personality, a social liberal, to sign all of our basic environmental legislation with enthusiasm, which has stood the test of time since then. So I encourage you to think about the points that I've made, many of which you've thought about before, and I hope that the interlocking of some of the major features in the dilemma that we face together will have provided some inspiration to you as you continue your activities, whether scholarly, individual, or group-oriented. Thank you very much. Sure, it's a little long.
Well, Peter, thank you for your inspirational lecture. And we do have time for some questions, and Peter's agreed to take your questions, and I'm going to let him call you himself. So stand up and please speak loudly. There are some microphones that are going around, so it'd be best to wait for the microphones.
Thank you very much for your lecture. It's very interesting. I know you spoke a lot about species loss with global warming.
About what?
Species loss with global warming. Is there a chance for species gain with global warming?
Not the kind that you want. Obviously, every major climatic change in the world encourages speciation, and obviously there will be gains, but not overall. The gains will be relatively small compared with the losses. And organisms, for example, with long life cycles and long gestation periods and all, are going to be hurt more than those with very short life cycles, et cetera, et cetera. But since we're losing whole communities, lots of kinds of organisms simply will have no suitable habitat. South Africa is one of the parts of the world which has a unique and fascinating botanical endowment, and people working in South Africa have calculated where the major climate types are going to be in 2050, and they're all twisted around and much smaller, with limited opportunities for the migration of very rare species from one to the other. And about half of South Africa in 2050 is going to be occupied by climates that don't even exist there now. So it's a very dicey business. Evolution can occur rapidly, of course, under challenging circumstances, as for example with the development of summer dry Mediterranean climates in relatively recent time geologically, but in no way will it compensate for what's being lost. I think we can say very confidently.
Sir, what is the impact of having all of this oil removed from the ground and burned up, besides the warming effect that it has and the CO2 production? Is there an impact on the Earth itself?
I'd say that's still up for grabs. Certainly in New Orleans, there was a feeling that the marshes might have sunk with pumping a lot of oil out of the ground there, but that seems to be debatable. So I think there should be an impact, but I think people haven't documented it well.
Your way of presenting this is very scary at first, but then inspiring later. And yet, I wonder, is there a way of presenting it to folks who want a cheery message and are turned off initially by the magnitude of the problem?
I think the best way I know is probably the one that David Suzuki and his associates have developed in Canada, which would be to start by asking people, and that would be depending on the group, start by asking people, in his case, what kind of a Canada they want 20 years from now. You say, what would you like it to be like? You know, let's list some of the attributes. And then people say, well, free of pollution, healthier, plants and animals around, clean water, clean air. And then you say, well, but we're not going in that direction. We're doing a lot of things that will stop us from arriving together at that destination. And that seems to be that's the most interesting, completely positive way I've seen of getting at it, because then you know you're aiming at a desired future. I can't say too much, and I'll just repeat one more time, though, that it does take individuals. Once I gave a lecture in Brisbane, Australia, a couple of years ago, and there were about 20 people left in the room, and they said, how can we make corporations and governments move more rapidly in these areas? And I said, just came to me, so I blurted out, well, how many people here don't want a better house, a better car, nicer vacation for their kids to go to Princeton, and so forth and so forth? And if you want all those things for yourself, why would you expect corporations and governments to make it more difficult for you to get them, even perceptually? In other words, we've got to find an agreement in ourselves that there's something wrong with that. And going back to my very first slides, that's one of the satisfactions with evangelical Christians, most of whom are united behind the fact that poor people, that it's simply not fair to put poor people in a situation, whether by global warming or any other way, where they're going to be mortally disadvantaged by your consumption. So a lot of people say, well, did you convince all those evangelical Christians of global warming or something? I said, no, they were already red hot about global warming before they ever talked to any scientists carefully about it. What they're anxious to get are particularly material for sermons and things like that. The evangelical churches are pretty well agreed to make all new churches and remodeling according to the principles of green architecture and so forth. And they have it well rooted in that belief. And I think that's the kind of belief that we all ought to have, because there's simply, even if you're a total pragmatist, there's no way to move away from huge masses of poor and underprivileged people in the world. It just doesn't work.
Peter, do you think the current global economic crisis is a setback to efforts to address these problems, because people will see any constraints on growth as a threat to their economic health, or is it an opportunity because, as you remarked, the incredible speed with which cooperative action was taken was unprecedented? But do you see this as having implications for addressing the problems that you've described to us?
My father used to have a cartoon on his wall that showed two men rushing out of an office building carrying briefcases, and one is saying to the other, I'm working so hard I'm killing myself, but I'm earning so much I can afford it. And I've always thought about that. Tim Wirth, of course, famously said, former U.S. Senator Tim Wirth famously said, and Herman Daly and other people helped, to this finding, so I don't know who really, but the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. In other words, it's really not possible to do anything that is purely economic and avoids the basic questions. We have there will be a new administration after the election, and thank God the pre-election period will end in something like 18 days, for which we all give mighty thanks. And I think it's up to each and every one of us, in the light of what I was just saying, whoever's elected, don't go around sulking about who they are or something or anything else. Just make sure they understand these values and that you give them good input and you explain them in the right way. They both seem to be moderately environmental. Neither one is deep in those areas, but they seem to be able to accept that. And I think the basic argument is simply it cannot be delayed. To reach an acceptable level of carbon dioxide, at which many people think that major changes beyond what we're talking about now can be avoided, Many people think that could be 450 parts per million compared with 380 now. Jim Hansen thinks it should be 350 parts per million. In other words, that we have to reduce it. But in any case, to do that is going to require an 80% reduction in the use of fossil fuels during the course of this century. And to calibrate that, I'll just point out that if the Kyoto Protocol had been ratified and implemented fully, it would have brought about a 4% reduction. So you can see what kind of a thing what kind of a situation we're facing, and how extraordinarily important each and every one of our understanding and action should be, and where should that be greater than in a great university.
Thank you very much for your talk. I know that there are a lot of students here who are very interested in what you've been talking about. Could you briefly talk about how we bring up the next generation to have very different expectations of consumption? I mean, confronted with all these potential shortages, perhaps one response would be to hoard and to gather more things to justify your existence and your community's long-term longevity. How do you balance out the longer term and educate the next generation?
Well, I think we're beginning to see that. I've got children. I've got 4 children, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So as I've gone through that and seen them grow up, the younger ones are not nearly as interested in consumerism as the older ones. I mean, not that the older ones are particularly consuming big, but the attitudes have changed greatly. And I can remember after World War II in the 40s and 50s, people used to regularly throw out bags of garbage from their cars along the roads. It was expected to be done, and people were wasteful in any one of a number of ways, and certainly not worrying about whether other countries in the world were sustainable or not. So I see big gains, and I see it coming pretty fast. And you know, it's below the surface. Americans rarely rate it number 1 or 2 anymore, but I think it's a very central issue for many of us, and I think we're feeling that. And if you have any influence over children individually or collectively, what you need to do is make that come true. My youngest child, who's a girl, works for a group called Global Connection in San Francisco, which brings in speakers from countries around the world, speak all over the United States on what conditions are really like in their countries, and then in the summer takes off work and goes down to the Mexican border and brings food and water out to people, to Mexicans who've been turned back and are in danger of starving or dying of thirst, you know, otherwise. And I think that's not a unique story. When I go around in St. Louis, I find dozens and dozens and dozens of small organizations manned by very inspirational people. And if you talk to university students, it's very elevating. I think you all know that, because although just as in our generation or any past generation, there are people who don't belong in the university or are gluttonous in various ways or have very poor values. But there are piles and piles of poets and dreamers and optimists and people intending to do something about it, people who don't think they need as much. It looks as if the heavy consumerism in the United States may have started in the late 1930s in a really big way as the Depression was lightening, and then advertising came in as a whole kind of almost a new profession in a really big way, or with a vengeance. And since then, you know, you don't have to be a mathematician to understand that the holiday sales can't go up 4% a year forever. I remember one of the first things that affected Paul Ehrlich and me in about 1965 was a British physicist wrote an article in the New Scientist which pointed out that at some date certain in the future, if we kept the level of population growth that was going at that time, we would, before very many thousands, you know, at a certain finite, we'd get to a point where human bodies were expanding away from the surface of the earth with the speed of light. And I think despite our preoccupation with all of these things, I think we all are internalizing this and bringing it into our souls, and what we can do individually is try to stimulate that to go even more rapidly.
Last question.
that sounded like a good ending, but I will ask a question anyway. I do a lot of work to remove invasive species around Princeton, and there was a fellow by the name of Revkin who came and gave a talk a couple of weeks ago. He does the .earth blog on the New York Times website. He's an environmental writer. And he made one comment about that it really doesn't make sense to go after invasive species, that they're just going to overwhelm us anyway, and that we should work to create, to maintain the function of ecosystems rather than trying to deal with invasive species. So I'm, a number of us are, wondering what your response might be to that.
His article in Science Times was one of the most bizarre and misleading articles I've ever seen, which really showed how the standards of the times in the science area have fallen drastically over the last years. He says New Zealand, nothing became extinct, sort of quoting an article, a very scholarly article in a very offhanded way. I've spent weeks tramping around pastures in New Zealand without seeing a single native plant, searching for the last remnants. And the question for us when it comes to invasives is really, do we want diverse, healthy communities like the ones that we found when we were children? And think about what places looked like when you were a child, if you can remember them. Or do we want the world to be homogenized and occupied by a very limited number of very aggressive invasive species? Quite apart from the attributes of native species are often much better for things like rain gardens or protecting erosion on banks or in many other ways. But I think for our ancestors for the past 2 million years who found inspiration in the variety of species around them, as for us, it's the diversity and the beauty of life on Earth that really enchants us. And in that case, to just throw up your hands and say, oh, let's let them all come, it's all great, they're on blah, blah, blah. Forgetting that that just lowers the total diversity of the Earth. Now, it will doubtless be lowered, it is being lowered, that's a lot of what I talked about. But unlike the dinosaurs, you probably saw the Gary Larson cartoon with the dinosaurs lined up and they're standing in a row and one's putting out his paw. I guess you wouldn't call it a hand, even though they're pretty anthropomorphic, and a snowflake is coming down, and there's a little furry thing running across in front, and he says, what are we going to do about this? The climate is changing, the mammals are taking over, and all we have is a brain the size of a walnut. I think we have to remember that we're supposed to be smarter than that. If we think that everything needs to be exactly where it is forever, we'd be very stupid. But if we think we don't have a role to play in generating rich, healthy, bountiful contours for the world of the future, we would be stupid to the point of immorality. And so I think keep up the good fight and tell Andy Revkin to shut up.